Welcome back, history students. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about the lives of American women in the 18th century, and then we're going to move into what's called the Age of Association, also known as America's first age of reform. But let's talk a little bit about the lives of women in the 18th century, which is the 1700s. So by the 1700s, wealthy women in America were expected to stay within the private sphere, cultivate the home. We already mentioned the private sphere and the public sphere in the lecture on the American Revolution. The private sphere is the home, and that's where women, especially wealthier middle class women, were expected to stay because the husband was considered the breadwinner. So the husband went outside the house, and the woman was expected to take care of the children and cook and clean and take care of the domestic household duties. The public sphere was mainly the domain of men, and we mentioned that before. That was where men conducted business. It was where the courts were. It was where men could gather in public areas like taverns. The only public area that was acceptable for women to be in was church on Sunday. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier video, women who came from lower socioeconomic classes were often in the public sphere more than wealthier women because they often had to work outside the home or help their husbands outside the home, and that was an economic necessity. So I'm not saying that women were never in the public sphere, but the wealthier you were as a woman, the less and less you were expected to be in the public sphere. Now, again, that was different in the Revolutionary era when a lot of women went outside the private sphere to help support the war effort. And that was kind of a moment when a lot of women kind of stepped out and it was acceptable for them to help with the war effort. But once the war was over, they were expected to go back to the private sphere. So we're going to talk about something called the cult of domesticity that emerged because of women's confinement to the private sphere. Many women were often confined to the private sphere, and what developed was that women often spent a lot of time with other women in the private sphere. And oftentimes women would form very close friendships with other women who also were expected to stay in the private sphere. So neighbors and friends they knew from church, and that was acceptable for women to form long, emotional, lifelong friendships with other women. And that became known as the cult of domesticity, was this almost cult of friendship that many women felt and had with their female friends. So those strong female friendships were very important for women because male-female relations were so restricted. For example, men and women had very little interactions outside of marriage. So women ended up relying a lot on their women friends to support each other, to confide in, and that's the cult of domesticity, or these lifelong friendships that many women formed with each other. Think about men and women spending time together. Even married couples did not spend a lot of time together in this time period. A lot of married couples lived in separate spheres, literally. Yes, they slept together at night in the same house, but come daybreak, the husband left to work. And the husband often would be gone for the whole day, for long hours, and the wife was home with the children alone. And a lot of women who were trapped in this private sphere often probably felt lonely, and that's why they developed these strong friendships with other women. And again, a lot of historians believe that these friendships developed through the fact that women, especially wealthy women, were confined to the private spheres. So that's the cult of domesticity that we see. Now, as time goes on, we're going to be looking at many time periods in this class. And as time goes on, women began to enter the public sphere more and more, then the cult of domesticity becomes less and less important. So in the 1700s it was very important because many women were confined to the private sphere. But again, as time goes on and times change and women are out more and more, then those friendships are less important. Let's look at women in work in the early 1800s. So let's talk about something called the Industrial Revolution. Now, most historians say that in America, the Industrial Revolution began after the Civil War. And yes, that is really when the U.S. began to take off with industry. However, industrialization has its roots in the early 1800s. Industrialization happens gradually, especially in the beginning in the early 1800s. Now, what do I mean by the term industrialization? That means that the U.S. begins to create more and more manufacturing plants and factories, and the U.S. begins to become a leader in industry, in manufacturing goods and selling goods. So as the U.S. began to slowly industrialize in the 1800s, it did affect Americans. And men and women were both affected by industrialization. There are new job opportunities for both men and women. Women have new job opportunities because of the rise of industry. Industry leaders realize that they could save money by hiring women to work in their factories rather than hiring men, because you could pay women less money than men for the same work. And so it doesn't take long before industry leaders start to realize that it would benefit them to hire women. And so we do see more job opportunities for women to work in factories and what we call mills. So I'm going to tell you the story of Lowell's Mill, which was an early factory in American history that only hired women workers. So Lowell's Mill is named for its founder, Francis Lowell. So I want to tell you a little bit about Francis Lowell, and then we'll talk about Lowell's Mill. And I'm going to show you a photograph in a minute. Francis Lowell, in the early 1800s, was an importer from Boston. His job was to import goods from Europe and sell them in the U.S. Now, at the time, the U.S. was having trouble with England and France that were attacking our ships because they were at war with each other and they were trying to stop our ships from bringing them supplies. And President Jefferson in the early 1800s decided that the U.S. will no longer trade with Europe. That's called a trade embargo. So temporarily, he shut down all trade in 1810 between the U.S. and Europe. That ruined Lowell's business because his business was importing goods. Well, there was no trade, so that was the end of importing goods for him. And he got depressed, and he ended up taking a trip to Europe to kind of figure out what he was going to do now. And he ended up going to England, the country of England, which was the world's leader in what's called the textile industry or the cloth industry. And he was able to take tours of England's textile factories. So every day he would go and he would tour a different textile factory to see how their factory worked. Now, England had laws that forbid the export of textile machines or plans to make a textile machine, because England didn't want other countries to compete with their textile industry. So you could tour a factory, but you couldn't get the plans on how to build their machines. And you couldn't buy a textile machine and have it shipped to America. That was illegal under English law. So Lowell was very, very clever. he would tour these mills, these factories during the day, and he would look at how the machines worked, and he would memorize how the machines worked. Then he would go back to his room at night and he would make plans for how to build the machine from memory, from looking at the machines. And then he smuggled his notes out of the country, which was illegal, back to the US. And he began to get investors together in Boston to open up a new textile factory. And he built the machines that he had plans for, that he had written from memory. And in 1813, he was ready to open this new factory that was known as Lowell's Mill. Now, here's the clever thing about Francis Lowell. He built a better machine than they had in England, than he even saw in England. His machine could take raw cotton and turn it into the finished product. Whereas in England, they had two separate machines that did that. He had one machine that did the whole thing. So this was going to be a very successful factory that was going to produce a lot of cheap textiles. There's a museum in Lowell, Massachusetts that shows you what a cotton mill looks like. So these are the machines that you would have seen in the 1800s in Lowell's Mill. But you needed people to load the machines and to monitor the machines during the day. So these machines don't work by themselves. You need people to man them. Lowell did not want to take advantage of the poor. But he also didn't want to pay high wages because he was starting out with this new factory and he didn't know if it was going to be successful or not. So what was the solution? Hire women. Because women could be paid less than men for the same work. There were no equal pay laws back then. So he advertised to the daughters of local farmers, farm families, send your daughter to Lowell's Mill. He built a dorm for the girls to live in. And this was a way for young women to work in Lowell's Mill, leave the rural area of their farm, come to the big city, by Boston, Lowell, Massachusetts, and help their family out with extra money or save money for when they got married. And these girls lived in Lowell's dormitory at the mill, and they were supervised by like a house mother, an older woman who would make sure the girls were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And Lowell promised the families that he would protect the girls' morals. Anyone who worked in Lowell's Mill who was caught breaking the moral code could be fired. If you were caught drinking alcohol, swearing, lying, if you broke curfew at night, you would be fired. All of the women who worked in Lowell's Mill had to attend church on Sunday. That was not an option, that was mandatory. By the end of the first couple years, there were over 1,000 applicants who wanted to work in Lowell's Mill. So Lowell really never had a hard time finding women to work in the mill. And in the beginning, working in Lowell's Mill was fun. It wasn't hard labor. In the early years, it was good. The women could take breaks. The pay was pretty good. The hours were reasonable. It was an opportunity for these young women to kind of get a change of scenery, get off the family farm, live with other girls their age, make some money for the family or make some money for their future. And it was exciting. It was exciting to kind of come and live in a new area. And so a lot of women wanted to work in Lowell's Mill in the beginning. And Lowell kind of set a precedent of other factories who wanted to hire women. He was one of the first ones that only hired women, and other factories followed suit. And so women were able to get a lot of jobs in factories. Now, working in a mill like Lowell's Mill changes in our country by the 1830s because there starts to be more and more competition for jobs, and that changes factory work in the U.S. Now, one of the reasons there's more competition for jobs is the beginning of immigration. We start to see the rise of immigrants coming in from Europe, And immigrant men were paid very low, so oftentimes their wives had to work, and many immigrants were willing to work for less money. And this is when the factory owners begin to take advantage of the workers after the 1830s, where factories like Lowell's Mill began to cut wages, extend the hours the women had to work, cut the breaks out. Now, in the mid 1830s, some of the Lowell's Mill women went on strike to try to send a message to management that they wanted to be treated fairly. Those strikes were not successful. And what ended up happening in factories like Lowell's Mill was a lot of the white farm girls who had once been the workers at Lowell's Mill began to leave mill work. That's because they weren't willing to work longer hours for less pay, and those jobs were replaced with immigrants. And especially 1830s and 1840s, we see immigrants coming in more numbers from places like Germany and Ireland, looking for a better life and more economic opportunities. In the 1840s, Ireland had a terrible potato famine, and many people died of starvation, and many people in Ireland left. Some of them ended up coming to the U.S., and a lot of immigrants needed work. There were children and women who also worked in factories, not just men. And so they replaced a lot of the local farm women who worked in places like Lowell's Mill. And as the competition for work came, so did the pay. The pay went down, and then the conditions of work deteriorated. Now, what if you are, let's say you're an immigrant woman, your husband makes very little money, but you have little kids at home. You have a couple babies. You can't go work in a place like Lowell's Mill because you can't bring your children. What do you do then? Well, then you do something called outwork. Many factories would hire women to do work at home that was known as outwork. So a lot of textile factories did this. The women would get the fabric from the factory, and then they would sew the fabric at home. And then the delivered finished product would be sent back to the factory. So outwork could be you have to sew buttons on a suit. That could be outwork. Or outwork could be you have to hem a skirt by hand at home. So outwork was usually doing finish work on a clothing product. And that's how you could work at home and make money, but not have to actually physically go to the factory. And many women did that to make money for their families without leaving their houses, was doing outwork. All right, before I move on, I want to talk about free African American women in the North and South. We're going to get to the Civil War later. Not all African Americans living in the U.S. are slaves. There are free African Americans living in the North and South in the early 1800s. So, what did they do for work? Well, African Americans, the men usually did a lot of the dangerous work and the lowest paying work because that's all they could find, because people would discriminate against them. But what about the women? What about free African American women? Some of the women were single mothers who needed to support their children. And they also would work in mills or factories. Or some African American women worked as domestic servants, working in someone's house and doing the domestic chores like cooking and cleaning. So if you were an African American woman working in the early 1800s, you would not only be paid less than men, you would be paid less than white women who were doing the same work or similar work. That was also true of immigrants. Many immigrant women would be paid less than white women would be paid for the same work. So there were no equal pay laws during this time period. All right, we're going to move into a time period in the early to mid 1800s that in women's history we call the Age of Association, but it's also known as America's first age of reform, about 1820 to 1845. This is the period of time before the Civil War. And there is a women's historian named Sarah Evans who coined the term, this is the Age of Association, because many women joined reform associations or clubs, and that's why it's called Age of Association in women's history. But it's also known as the first age of reform, sometimes called the antebellum reform period because it was before the Civil War. So I'm not going to get too far into this in this video, but I'm just going to give you the background of it. In this time period, Americans are inspired to reform or fix society. Now, the reason for that, I'm going to get into in the next video. However, there are many women who are going to be involved in reforming and joining these reform groups or associations, voluntary associations, to help fix society. And women of many different economic classes were involved in trying to fix society. And the main motivator for getting women to want to fix society was religion. So in the next video, I'm going to get into what the Second Great Awakening was and how that inspired people to want to reform. And then we're going to get into what reforms were women involved in the Age of Association. So that's where I'll leave this video, and I'll see you in the next one.